But the first thing, if you get the book, on the back cover, I have, of course, Jefferson, to whom I dedicated the book. Could not do otherwise, obviously. Maybe I should have also dedicated it to Dumas Malone, since when you spoke to him, you thought you were speaking to Jefferson, but his books are all cited in here. And as Jefferson wrote to James Madison, no society can make a perpetual constitution. You've already given them the citation. Every constitution, said Jefferson, naturally expires at the end of 19 years. If it be enforced longer, it is an act of force and not of right. I don't know if Jefferson meant that quite as he had written it. It was perhaps an exaggeration for his time. But I do believe that he thought it was important for Americans to regularly review the content of the Constitution and see what needed to be changed and updated. Now, how did Madison respond? Well, possibly Madison was simply trying to keep Jefferson happy. I don't know. But he agreed with Jefferson when he wrote him back in February of 1790. And he said, "It would give me singular pleasure to see your principle first announced in the proceedings of the United States and kept always in their view as a salutary curb on the living generation from imposing unjust or unnecessary burdens on their successors." Well, that's a direct endorsement of frequent, at least consideration, of constitutional reform. Washington was even blunter, and there were a number of citations that fit. I chose one that from a letter to a relative of his that he had written in November 1797. And he said, the people of the United States, for it is with them to judge, can leave the door open for change because they will have the advantage of experience on their side. They will decide with as much propriety on the alterations and amendments to the Constitution which are necessary as ourselves. I do not think we, that is the current generation, certainly the senior founders, we are more inspired, have more wisdom, or possess more virtue than those who will come after us. And George Mason endorsed it, and in my endorsement, in my dedication to Jefferson, I of course cite his 1787 letter to James Madison. I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing and is necessary in the political world as storms in the physical. And I hope that this book would be a little bit of rebellion, and I think it is to a certain degree. The paperback also has a wonderful citation from John Adams, who late in life was written by a young man who had studied the founders' lives and works, and he wrote to Adams, as young people often do, as an idol. And he said, you know, I've read everything you've written about the Constitution, and your fellow founders have written about the Constitution, and we were so fortunate, and every word was divinely inspired, and the young person got very worked up. And Adams, who was, of course, extremely blunt, wrote him back and said, young man, I ought to be grateful that unlike so many of your contemporaries, you're actually respectful to your elders. But I think your position is exactly wrong. You should be reading the Constitution with a critical eye and suggesting changes. That's what Adams wrote several years before he died. So I think I'm on solid ground, at least in proposing some changes and looking at some possibilities. Now, I can't go through all 23. I wouldn't want to go through all 23, and we wouldn't have any time for questions. I'm just going to mention some, and then we'll go in about 10 minutes to your questions and discussion. I suggest, just to start out with a very radical proposal, as we look at the first branch, the Congress, and we analyze the United States Senate, it's important to recognize that as the United States has grown and as the population growth has been concentrated in just a handful of states, we now have a situation where just 17% of Americans, 17% of Americans elect a majority of the United States Senate. That means on the subjects on which the 17% in those states can stick together, such as transportation formulas and education formulas, usually the expenditure of money, the 17% can run the other 83%. Well, you know, the founders were concerned about the tyranny of the majority. I'm with them. I'm always concerned about minority rights. But isn't there such a thing as the tyranny of the small minority? Shouldn't we be concerned also about the tyranny of the small minority. And it's actually worse than the 17%, because under current rules, which are not constitutional, but are rules of the Senate, you need 60 votes to run the United States Senate. You can't get anything major passed without 60 votes. Well, that means just 41 senators can stop anything from happening under most circumstances in the Senate. Well, how many Americans can elect 41 senators? 11%. So 11% of the people can run 89% of the people. Again, it's the tyranny of the small minority. So to Clifton's disgust, I propose not making the Senate another House of Representatives. I want the smaller states to be better represented in the United States Senate, but I simply propose granting the 10 states with the greatest population, as revised every 10 years in the census, that they should receive 2 additional senators. They would have 4 senators. And the next 15 states in population, revised every 10 years according to the census, would get 1 additional senator. And no state would be deprived of its current 2 senators. So it would be a larger Senate, but much smaller than the House of Representatives. And if you crunch the numbers, you would find that about 40% of Americans could elect a majority of the Senate. So you'd still have minority rights well represented, and yet it makes a little bit more sense to me to have 40% running the 60% rather than 11% running the 89%. So you can imagine how that's gone over in Wyoming. That is definitely one state I visited for the last time. They have a lot of guns there. Now, what about the House of Representatives? There, I propose a regime for nonpartisan redistricting, mandatory nonpartisan redistricting, and with a wide variety of methods. It could be a judicial commission, it could be an Iowa-style system, using legislative bureaus and nonpartisan analysts. You can do a wide variety of things, but nonpartisan redistricting is an idea whose time came 30 years ago, and we still don't have it. And it's the source of so many of the problems in Congress and in the state legislatures. Because essentially we have a system now whereby the people really don't pick the representatives. The representatives, at least via the state legislatures, get to pick their voters. And that's exactly opposite to the intentions of the founders and exactly opposite to the proper running of any representative democracy. So nonpartisan redistricting. And then I'm going to let you read about the changes in terms. I had a good time changing the House terms to 3 years and having Senate terms coincide with presidential elections and expanding the House to 1,000 members. And people say, oh my God, you're going to more than double the House of Representatives, double the trouble? And yet part of the provision is to keep the budget the same with an inflation factor so that you would divide the budget among 1,000. They would have far fewer staff aides. Their constituencies would be far smaller. They would have a chance to meet their constituents personally with greater frequency. It would be easier for challengers to defeat the incumbents because you won't need nearly as much money. You can do a door